So, hi everyone. We are very happy to start today's talk. We are delighted to have here with us at NICHE Professor Nicola Di Cosmo, who's an old friend of ours and of the university. In fact, he is a graduate. Initially, he started off as a young man here at Foscari, where he graduated with Professor Giovanni Stari. A few years ago, just a few years ago, enough with all those dates. Professor Nicola Di Cosmo is the Henry Luce Foundation Professor of East Asian Studies at the Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton. In fact, in the School of Historical Studies at Princeton. He holds a PhD from Indiana University, and before joining the Institute, he was also lecturing in several other institutions, including the University of Canterbury, and he's lectured also at Pennsylvania, at Columbia, and New York University, Shanghai, where we first met a few years ago. His research interests are vast, and they are mostly in the field of Chinese and Inner Asian frontiers from ancient to the modern period. He's also focusing on the history of nomadic peoples and the history of the Qing dynasty, the last imperial dynasty of China. He has co-authored many of them fundamental books in the field, including Ancient China and Its Enemies, 2002, Manchu-Mongol Relations on the Eve of the Qing Conquest, 2003, and The Wonderful Diary of a Manchu Soldier in 17th Century China, 2006. He has edited and co-edited several other books, including Military Culture in Imperial China, The Cambridge History of Inner Asia, Warfare in Inner Asian History, 500 to 1500, Empires and Exchange in Eurasian Late Antiquity, and many other books. And I also want to mention a book in Italian here, and we're very happy to have this book, Venezia e i Mongoli, Commercio e Diplomazia sulle vie della seta nel Medioevo, with Biella 2022. The scholarship that we have just mentioned is not all Nicola is concerned with, and the reason why we are so happy, particularly to have him here at NICHE, is that he's been pioneering the study of paleoclimate and proxy data and historical studies. And I could mention a number of articles here, but I just want to cite Environmental Stress and Steppe Nomads 2018, which I think is partly not what you are going to discuss with us here today. And so this work, he started around 10 years ago, 10 years ago, and it was really an interesting and important effort at the time, because it was not very common for historians to really engage with climatologists and so on. So perhaps at the end you will tell us a little bit about that as well, if we may. So please welcome Nicola Di Cosmo for today's lecture, which is part, in fact, of our ongoing effort to deal with Asia and Asian environmental history, and it's part of a lecture series that was started with Maddalena Berenghi, who can't be here with us, unfortunately, today, and we started off last year, and this is the 5th lecture of the series. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Francesca, for this wonderful introduction. It's great to be here among old and new friends, and especially an audience of environmental humanists, which is particularly important to me for reasons that you will find out very soon. It's also great to be at Foscari, where I found a lot of energy and a lot of ideas and enthusiasm, and I truly enjoyed the environment of Foscari. I've been involved in this interdisciplinary research with climatologists and other scientists for now quite a number of years. It's kind of complicated, but it stems from the need to connect more to the world of science. Why do we need to connect more to the world of science? Well, when we think about the challenges that we face today, and we all know what they are: climate change, biodiversity, and human diversity as well, of course, and environmental and economic inequalities, and human movement, of course. Human movement that is undoubtedly connected with all of these other natural disasters and natural challenges that we're facing. The costs of, scarcity of water, scarcity of food, economic opportunities are clear drivers of human movement today. And the costs of infringing upon what we may call what have been called planetary boundaries, that is, the thresholds of sustainability in the world, include the sacrifice of the societies, the sacrifice of ecologies that are not normally included in what we might call the economic calculus of our societies. And I was reminded of this very powerfully, listening online to Andrea Rinaldo's lecture that he gave in Padova yesterday. He's the president of the Istituto Veneto and also the recent winner of the Stockholm Prize for Water, and so the sort of Nobel Prize for Water, who reminded us of, as I said, of the real costs behind our new modernity, if you like. So the need for a new calculus requires, in my view, a greater collaboration among scientists, social scientists, anthropologists, urbanists, economists, and so on. And the question is, where are the humanists in all of this? For me, I'm sure other people have answered this questions before, but for me as a historian, and as a historian of the past, of the remote past also, this is an important question. And this is all experimental, my work, but also the questions I posed are experimental in some ways, but they definitely affect my work and how I position myself among other historians. In my view, one of the possible roles of humanists is really try to find ways for different realms of knowledge to communicate among each other, in a way that could be productive in order to find a more integrated knowledge, the sort of epistemic awareness or epistemic consciousness that we need to build. Maybe the humanist has a role, a function in that. But I am not just a humanist, I'm a historian. I'm a historian who is interested in the connections also between past and present. Past societies, how they developed, evolved, affected other societies. And also as a historian, I'm interested in understanding the past in a better way. And I find that an integrated knowledge, this idea of breaking down some barriers among different realms of knowledge can help us not just connect the present with the past in a better way, but also understand the past in its own right. And if we can, open a path towards a more integrated knowledge systems, this would be, in fact, a good thing, in my view. And so much of my research is very experimental on how to link together scientific knowledge and historical knowledge to find new answers to problems, what I see as problems. And this is... the role of, now it would be interesting to start this question with Voltaire. I think there is a problem with the Enlightenment that we have to tackle at some point. But Voltaire, this is interesting because he addressed in a very dismissive way the movement of peoples, especially the people I deal with, which are nomadic people, Central Asian peoples, by saying, if you have nothing to tell us, but that on the banks of the Oxus and the Jaxartes, using the Greek names for the Sir Darya and Amu Darya in Central Asia, one barbarian has replaced another barbarian. In what respect do you benefit the public? I could say a lot about this quote and where it comes from and all the polemical force that Voltaire felt against somebody called Joseph de Guigne, who wrote a very big history of Turks, Huns, and Mongols, and so on and so forth. But the basic problem is these people, these barbarians from Central Asia, these nomads, were really not part of what a historian should study. They didn't really contribute anything. Now, things have changed since Voltaire, but not very much. And one of the things that have changed is the place of, let's say, these nomads within a particular type of history, which is world history or global history. They have gained a new value, let's say, a new balance, because of reasons that I will discuss very soon. But before we go there, let me also focus the attention on this book that everybody knows and is very famous. It's been translated in so many languages, and that is to me at least, is a very important book because it makes climate as part of history, climate is a function of time, varies, is subject to fluctuation, it's the object of history. So these questions just one second. So climate was no longer a static thing as it was for authors in the past. Each part of the world had its own climate that didn't change ever. Now the climate became a subject of history, and from that, let's say, new awareness that climate is actually the subject of history, we might ask whether actually the fact that one barbarian moves after another on the banks of the Oxus of the Jaxartes may not hide a more important question than Voltaire was able to detect, or I do think, in fact, that climate is a very important driver in Eurasian history, and it affected pastoral societies, and we should recover that knowledge from history also to understand the place of this extremely fragile, extremely vulnerable type of society in our present time. So this is what I'm going to talk about. First of all, a general introduction. How does climate affect pastoral nomads? What are the actual drivers, let's say, of climate drivers that lead to environmental crises or social crises or political shocks of some kind. Then I will another introduction to the historical presence of steppe empires in what I consider to be world history. So why are they important at all? Are they a civilization? They've never been called a civilization, the steppe people, but they definitely act as one. So we might also reconsider that. And then I will turn to some case studies in which I show practically how the inclusion of climate data can help us actually solve problems. How these more integrated knowledge systems might work in practice. So So this is pastoral nomads and climate. These images are just stock images of the steppes in Mongolia, you know, herds of horses, and everybody knows about that. But this sort of bucolic environment can actually be subject to very important shocks. These are this is from a recent time in 1999, 2000. They had a very big, very high rate of mortality in the steppes, caused by a so-called winter disaster. So when a very large proportion of horses and sheep and cows die due to a complex number of reasons, but basically because they don't have access to the grass because of ice that forms on top of the ground. So basically, sometimes it's also very snowy, and so they just can't access the grass and they die, not of starvation, but hypothermia, actually. So in 1999, 2000, and then 2010, when there was another disaster, the Mongolian government appealed to the United Nations and to various international organizations for help, for assistance. Now, you can imagine that my first question was, well, what did the nomads in 857 do? What could they do in the past to respond to this type of crisis that periodically destroy large parts of their livelihood, the livestock on which they rely? So that's, and here you see there is also a drought. A drought is this other very large problem. When we have a drought in Mongolia, obviously there is not enough grass. Sheep die. So there are these two types of disasters that are the most dangerous, to which the societies is most vulnerable. And that is the winter disaster. There's very large snowfalls or freezing cold temperatures that prevent the animals from getting the nutrients from the grass, or long extended droughts. The worst case is when you have a drought in the summer and a dzud in the winter. Dzud is the Mongol word for it, for the winter disaster, because weakened animal die at a much higher rate than not so weak animal. So that happens also today quite often. So these are the two complicated problematic, I should say, situations that pastoral nomads face even today, and they've faced for a very long time. This is not necessarily related. I mean, the rate and severity of these cases may be related to climate change, but it doesn't mean that we didn't have the same problems in the past. We certainly did. So how do we connect these climate events to the history of these Eurasian nomads? Well, there are different ways. I mean, we can imagine that a greater, a more affluent society with more animals and so on may be able to have a more complex social and political structures, for instance. You can imagine a more stratified society with people owning more of the animals and some people owning less, fewer animals. You can imagine expansion of a political power into other areas, and there are different categories that people use in order to define these different political formations. Could be chiefdoms, regional power, empire, and so forth. And also a phenomena like urbanization of the steppes may seem strange to people, but in fact, it's a growing area of archaeological research, is urbanization of the steppes. The steppes have changed in several ways across history, and urbanization has been one of them, for instance. But also the type of resources that states, these nomadic states, some people find this an oxymoron to speak of a nomadic state, but actually they were some kind of a kind of state, a pre-modern state, of course. How they could mobilize armies for war, or how they could gather people for religious or state functions. These are all questions that relate to resources and therefore also relate to the environment and to their economy. But we focus today on steppe empires, this large expanding, powerful, sometimes political formation that came into being at several points in history in the central Eurasian steppes, but especially Mongolia. Mongolia has been the birthplace of most Eurasian empires. And here, I mean, there are these characterizations are very, very simple. I'm really not looking at my notes anymore. They were established by pastoral nomads. The original place was especially Mongolia. Steppe nomads controlled and at times unified under their rule the greater part of Central Eurasian landmass. This is important because, these are really very, very large political formations. And one of their historical roles is to connect various civilizations, China, the Middle East, Europe, India, and also to be the agents behind the so-called Silk Road, those who facilitated trade, movement of peoples, and so forth. So these are that's why they are important for world history, because they have this role of connecting different regions, different peoples, different cultures, different civilizations, and favoring exchanges over large geographic areas. So this is the on top. You can see the yes. It doesn't matter. So, okay. You can see on top the so-called steppe belt that runs across the middle of Eurasia, all the way from Hungary and the Ukraine, all the way to eastern Mongolia and Manchuria. And this is a particular, of course, ecological zone or environmental zone below the taiga and the tundra and above the temperate zone. And this is the area that favors the formation of economic pastoral societies, or nomadic pastoral societies. And nomads crossed over these steppe belt, grassland belt over time across history. But this comes from our environmental consciousness, let's say. It must have made a difference if the grass looked really nice and green, and happy, or dry and sad, right? And so, how does this difference affect the movement of people, the formation of states, the formation of empires? So these are the kind of questions that, and they're also important today. I mean, as we think about the movement of people and also their livelihood. So I'm sure you know about these steppe empires, but just to refresh your memory, we start with the Scythians described by Herodotus in ancient Greece. They extended, we have a lot of information about these so-called Scythians, mostly today from archaeology. I mean, massive amount of information. So there's no doubt that these people had a very big impact on Eurasia, and they were described as mature nomadic pastoral societies in the Greek sources. Then we have now whether the Scythians formed an empire is a question of about which Chris Beckwith has recently written a book. He's convinced that they formed an empire. I'm much less convinced, but nevertheless, they were important. Whether they formed an empire or not, they were still very important. Now, the first documented empire is the one of the Shunu or Hunnu or Huns or Asiatic Huns. I mean, there are lots of names, but this is in Eastern, in Eurasia, in Mongolia and Northern China, contending with the Chinese Empire. Then way to the west, we have Attila the Hun forming his own empire, and the debate about where the Huns came from is still very much open. A lot of archaeological work here, a lot of and some climatic work. I mean, Ed Cook, who is a climatologist, paleoclimatologist at Columbia University, wrote an article about the Asian origins of Huns and Avars and migrations based on climatic research, connecting mega droughts in Central Asia with El Nino, Southern Oscillation, variation. I mean, great climatological work, but in fact useless to historians, because we really don't know where these Huns came from. So it's still, and we may connect this even with Venetian history, if it is true that Attila the Hun pushed people to inhabit the lagoon in 452. Of course, Gerardo Ortali has written a book denying any such legend, and he's, I'm sure, right. But nevertheless, the Huns did exist, did invade and raid Italy and Europe, and so they can't be dismissed as a force in shaping European, especially the Roman, as Peter Heather has claimed, the Roman Empire. Then we move to the Middle Ages. We look at the ancient Turk Empire, the first one to really unify the whole of Inner Asia, all the way from Byzantium to Mongolia. The Uyghur Khaganate is, let's call it empire, although it was ruled by Kagan, but still. And then the Mongol Empire, and then which is kind of the gold standard of all of these nomadic empires, but their influence doesn't stop there. The institutions, their social structure, the political structures can be found in the Ottoman Empire, in the Mughal Empire, in the Timurids, in the Manchus, who then conquered China in the 17th century. So there is a long tradition of political institutions as well that doesn't end with the end of these Inner Asian nomadic empires. So this is just now the four cases that I want to discuss, and I will go rather fast here because then I want to leave some time for discussion, are all based one way or another in Mongolia, and the fourth case is about Hungary. But the first, so I've published on each of these topics, and so I can feel fairly confident that our research has benefited a lot from both climatological or paleoclimatology, as well as history and in some way archaeology. So it could not have been done without a close collaboration of all of these people. And designing this type of research was perhaps the most difficult part of it. Once we had an idea what we wanted to demonstrate and to prove, then it became slightly easier. But But you will see, because they are all very different cases, and they really go against what I would call, I would define as common knowledge. They are counterintuitive, the results that we got. And that makes, in my view, this type of research more valuable. So this is the first, I mean, chronologically, in terms of the empire that we studied, not in terms of publication. This was a study on, so each study had a question, so a research question, which in this case is the Eastern Turk Empire was defeated by the Tang Empire in 630 CE. Could climate change have been implicated in the political and economic crisis of the Eastern Turk Empire? So the Eastern Turk Empire, I'm not going to tell you the ins and outs of this, but in any way it was created from the breakup of the Turk Empire in the 6th century. This is the eastern part. It was established around the 590 or so, and in 630 it collapsed. And why is that? The historical sources tell us that there was a famine in the empire that greatly weakened the power of the Khan or Kagan, as it was. So we started to look at the possible climate origin or climate reason for this famine and economic crisis, because in fact, in 626, that is 4 years before it collapsed, the Turk Empire looked very healthy. They had almost reached the Chinese capital, the Tang capital, almost stormed it. The Chinese emperor had to go out and negotiate peace treaty with them, giving them a lot of money, a lot of tribute. So we look at the climate proxies, which that is, 3 rings, and to reconstruct the temperature of that part of the world. Of course, this is the most difficult thing, to have a regional rather than sort of hemispheric reconstructions, which is possible because of high resolution proxies such as 3 rings from close to that area. And so there was a clear cooling in this region of the Turk Empire. The precipitation records indicated heavy snowfalls, so higher than average precipitation. And also the Greenland ice cores indicated a clear signal of sulfate, that is volcanic eruption, just before the collapse of the Turk Empire. Now, volcanic eruption bring a cooling of the temperature as a result for about a couple of years after the eruption itself. So if an eruption is in 626 or 627, we would expect 2 or 3 years of lower than average temperatures, either worldwide or within a certain hemisphere. So everything indicated that, in fact, there was a severe cooling of temperature and also higher than normal precipitation. This is more of a, what the climatologists like to do, to show the. So I think that what I need to point out is that there is a larger context to this. An article in which I also participated on the so-called late antique Little Ice Age. That is a period that was colder than normal. It used to be called the Dark Ages, cold period, Dark Ages, cold period. Late antique Little Ice Age is a little bit better than the Dark Ages. All the proxies and the volcanic indicated a cooling probably connected with the volcanic, higher than average volcanic activity. Here is again, we can see on the A line the volcano eruptions detected in the Greenland ice cores, and the red line is the reconstructed temperature, and you can see how it really plummets at some point in the blue line, producing many years of below average temperatures. I hope this is clear, but I can explain. So we came to a conclusion at some point that indicated several. So we try to connect these climate data with the historical data to understand better what was the reason for the crisis of this Turk Empire. And it's not to say, well, there was a terrible weather and therefore the Turk Empire collapsed. This is not right. So what we found is that indeed there was a cooling and all the causes of the cooling sort of checked out. But one of the problem why this crisis was so deep is that the economy of the Eastern Turk Empire, and that is what the Khan or Kagan relied on, came from three sources. The first one was pastoral production. Second one was taxation of subordinate tribes. Third one was tribute from China. As the pastoral, you remember what I showed you before, these periods when, or these climate shocks that destroy a large part of the livestock, something like that must have happened for probably 2 years in a row, reducing dramatically the number of animals. So that made the Khan very weak, because in Chinese records, we even have descriptions of starvation among the Turks, with bleeding gums and teeth falling off, etc. And this is so there was clearly, but the subordinate tribes rebelled, so they stopped paying taxes quite smartly. And also the Chinese decided that they were not going to pay tribute anymore, because they could not, these treaties could not be enforced militarily. So eventually the Tang armies entered the territory of the Turk Kagan, captured the Kagan, who was actually taken to China and died a few years later, apparently of a broken heart. So second case, now the successor of the Turk Empire was the Uyghur Empire. This Uyghur Empire went through, and I described this recently in another class, went through what is the most severe and the longest drought in the whole climate history of Mongolia. So the climatologists asked, how could this empire survive that kind of, 50 years of drought? Yeah, and a valid question, I would say. What the climatologists wanted to say is, well, perhaps the whole dynasty, the whole empire collapsed because of the drought. And I said, hold on, let's have a look at what happens. So the first thing was, there is no question that there was this drought. These are the records through three-ring based temperature reconstruction and precipitation reconstruction from two different sites in Mongolia. They are fairly they indicate the same thing, and also here we see the precipitation, I think, this is year by year, the rate of the drought rate in Mongolia. The brown, which is a little bit everywhere in the second part, indicates the depth of the drought. You see on top, I think it's covered. Unfortunately, you cannot see what's written on top, but it's the early part of the empire from 744 to 782. You can see that the Mongolian region is mostly green, but from 783 to 844, when the empire collapsed, is brown, which means very low precipitation. So by looking at the Uyghur Empire, we decided to question whether the fact that it survived for such a long time under such trying circumstances, let me repeat, 50 years of drought, with peaks that were among the most severe and deep in the whole 2,000 years history of climate history of Mongolia. We decided to look at the differences between the Turk Empire that preceded the Uyghurs. They are the same people. Turk and Uyghurs are the same people, same language. Slightly different political structure, but same people. Same economy. They were both pastoral nomads. So by comparing the two, we found several differences. First of all, unlike the Turks, we don't find a conflictual relationship with China. In fact, there was trade with China, not conflict and tribute. So the military power of the Uyghurs seems to have waned after some time, which may have been the result of this contraction of their pastoral economy. And they focused on trade, which again brought a lot of money in the form of silk to the Uyghurs that they could then use to create a greater economic power and purchase things that they need. And also they developed irrigated agriculture and urbanization. So there are very deep differences. So the conclusion is maybe, of course, hypothetical, the drought pushed the Uyghurs to diversify their economy and to create other sources of income that were not quite as vulnerable, did not make them as vulnerable as the equivalent of a monoculture, like pastoral production. So this was our hypothesis. This is how we conceived of the Uyghurs as maybe a resilient story, although eventually the Uyghurs were defeated by another nomadic group and became indeed quite weak. This is the first article of this series that I wrote, and this is a different one. This is, again, the climatologists provide the information. In this case, the information was, again, something that they found surprising. 15 years of above average rain, precipitation, right at the time when Genghis Khan leads the Mongols into a series of expeditions and campaigns against China, the Tanguts, Central Asia. How could they do that? How could they field so many armies for such a long time? And therefore the question, did this pluvial period, as they called it, contribute to the ability of the Mongols to project their military power outside Mongolia? And again, we have, as you can see here, between 1210 and 1227, a very wet period marked with the green in a green color, which means really that you saw before the two images of the dry and wet steppes. This was very wet, very green, very flush. Really could increase the carrying capacity of this of the steppes quite a lot, and therefore increase the production, the resources for a more centralized state, for a more centralized government. This is what we thought. This is what a graph of the campaigns of the Mongols, which started actually before this pluvial period, but could continue for about 15 years after that. In fact, it should be 1225 when Genghis Khan came back to Mongolia. But here you see, a Mongol people of maybe 1 million people in the 13th century, taking on 3 major empires. So how do you, the reason that we thought might be behind that was that in fact they had extra resources to devote to these military campaigns, in particular horses. Horses are, so this is the expansion of the Mongol Empire that under Genghis Khan. And this is the conclusion that we came up with, that is a rapid economic recovery after an extended period of war of 30 years. There was a 30-year war before Genghis Khan unified the Mongols. So they needed to get back on track with the economy, let's say. And this extra productivity of the steppes provided possibly a reliable supply of horses for a military campaign over a long period of time, which means about 15 years. There is a higher carrying capacity of the land. There is also development of agriculture, for instance, that we find around the capital, Karakorum, with wheat and barley and millet. And cannabis, actually, quite a lot. So a centralized government, which was established in Mongolia at that time, could use these resources to launch a project, a plan, a program for political and military expansion. And finally, the most controversial of the cases, which has led to a whole cottage industry of articles, but I will not deal with those, with that kind of fallout. The Mongol Empire included, as you know, and as you saw before, a very large mass of the Eurasian continent. A large portion from China to the Middle East. So in the beginning, or let's say in the second wave of expansion, the Mongols conquered Russia and pushed themselves into Eastern Europe, Poland and Hungary. And then they decided to stay in Hungary for a while. Hungary, as I said before, is the western end of this steppe belt. If you've been to Hungary, you know that there is the grassland, the puszta, and so on. And it's not actually very good but it provided space for a lot of nomads actually coming over time from Central Asia. And the Mongols seem to think that that was a good place to stay. In 1241, they entered, and this is an interesting map made by actually Hungarian historians. The red dots indicate where the Mongols came through the Carpathian Mountains. Hungary is surrounded by mountains, and there is this big Carpathian chain in the east. Three columns of Mongols came into the Hungarian plains, and they won every battle. The red dots are the victories, the Mongol victories. Some of them went all the way to Poland as well. And then they established themselves in eastern Hungary during the spring and summer and autumn and fall of 1241. Then something happened. In 1242, one winter, or January 1242, it was a very, very cold winter. The Danube froze over. And the Mongols thought, why don't we cross into Western Hungary? But as they crossed into Western Hungary, riding across the frozen Danube, what happened was that their success rate during the spring months of 1242 decreased tremendously. They couldn't take a single place anymore. I mean, what happened? They were also pursuing, by the way, the Hungarian king who was running away. It reached the Dalmatian coast, as everybody knows. And so the Mongols were in hot pursuit of this, of Bela IV, the Hungarian king. And so this was an interesting contrast between an early period when they were winning every battle and a later period where they were losing every battle, basically. And so what was going on? So that was the beginning of thinking about this event in a different way, until very recently. And for 50 years, actually, historians had thought, well, different reasons why the Mongols withdrew in 1242. Climatologist Ulf Björntgen and I, this is just two people who wrote this article, decided to look at the high resolution data, climate data, and trying to figure out what could have happened in that winter. So all the climate reconstructions from tree ring records seem to indicate, or almost all of them, that there was a lower temperatures and higher precipitation. So if you look at this series of maps, now the pink is warmer, the blue is colder. If you look at 1241, Hungary, where the star is quite warm and dry. In 1242 is quite cold. And as we see here, also wet. The yellow star just indicates the year that we are considering. But 1241, you will see that the part of Hungary that we're interested in is more brown and therefore drier. And 1242, pretty green, which means wet. Now, I have to trust these climate reconstructions, but I do trust them. I mean, they are all the data seem to be pointing in that direction. So in the spring, late spring and early summer, the Mongols leave Hungary. And they leave Hungary saving Europe. Of course, there were all these apocalyptic notions that the Mongols were going to destroy Europe. And so it was an act of God. What was it? Some people thought, oh, they went back because the Ugodei, the Khan, had died. So they had to participate in a meeting in Mongolia. But, Batu, who was leading these Mongol troops, did not go back to Mongolia. They just went back to southern Russia, where their main camp was and capital Sarai was. So we started to think, well, there are environmental limits to how the Mongol army can operate. The Mongol army in those days was still a cavalry army, a light cavalry army. So each soldier had probably 5 horses. Some people say 7, but let's say 5. So you have hundreds of thousands of horses that have to be fed in, and maybe there is no problem. The Hungarian pusta can feed that many horses. But this army requires the right environmental condition in order to operate. And once you have very cold temperatures and a lot of water in the system, A lot of water that cannot be drained, by the way, because the water table in Hungary is very high. And until the Habsburgs drained the river basins of the Danube, the Tisa, and all the others, there were repeated cyclical floods in Hungary, exactly for that reason. The water table was high. Then when there was excess water, didn't have any place to go. So cold, rainy winter caused an accumulation of frozen groundwater that, when thawing, flooded the various areas, causing swampy conditions. So mud, a lot of mud, which may very well explain why the Mongols could not really storm cities. I mean, it's very difficult to have an army on horseback moving through swamps, essentially. So this was the reason why we thought, and this is a hypothesis, that there was an environmental limit to how that type of army could function. And the environmental limit was that it needed not just a certain amount of food and grass and so on, but also relatively dry conditions, such as those that you find in Mongolia, because it cannot operate in a quagmire in a swamp. And once Hungary was turned into a swamp, they, surrounded by enemies, you have to think that these are military leaders. They don't like to be surrounded by enemies and being also essentially paralyzed. Speed was one of the main. So this is why we thought the Mongols, following the higher altitude of the Southern Carpathians through Serbia and Bulgaria and so on, they withdrew eventually to. And so in all of these cases, we changed what people thought until then. With the Mongol rise of the Mongols, people have thought for a long time that actually it was a drought that pushed the Mongols out of Mongolia. We said, well, maybe not, and connected it with greater resources. And in this case, we looked at how the environmental changes possibly inhibited the Mongol army and made it difficult for them to, let's think, there are many examples in history. Let's think of Napoleon in Russia, that where you have a similar dynamics going on. So in practice, we have tried to integrate climate data, science data in historical analysis in a way that I think practically advances our understanding of the connection between environmental conditions and political, economic, or other conditions. So does this type of research help us? I think it does, obviously help us, but it's also the method that we use that we are now trying to stabilize a little bit, because until now it's very experimental. We are trying to use different types of records and so on but do we have a method? It's very pragmatic, this approach. Do we, we are trying to integrate more and more data, more and more information, also involving archaeologists, for instance, and so on. So I think I should close here. I'm sure I'm over time. Oh, I didn't think there was another slides, but you can read this and we can discuss it later. Well, basically, it says the same thing that I've just said. So the climate history of nomadic empires, I think, can really shed light on human decisions based on actual environmental conditions that shaped how they could achieve their goals or not. And that is important. It's not determinism. It's not mechanical cause-effect relations. It's about, you know, a set of circumstances that influences human choice. And that is probably the main point of my lecture today. Thank you.
So you can see the pillage and plunder by, yes, but don't harm the environment. Yeah, so, yeah. And what's the image?
The image is
The photograph. Oh, yeah.
Photograph. Migration. Very difficult. Yeah, people are seriously affected by that. So this is.
Yeah. Thank you, Nicola, for this very rich and thought-provoking presentation. And I'm sure there are many questions from the audience, probably from the historians. I can see that, yes, there's a, so I'll hand, I guess, this microphone, or maybe if you can come forward, Pietro.
So thank you, Nicola. Very much material for thoughts. So I would like to get back to your initial question, which is a question that we've been discussing for a while, the role of historians in discussing climate knowledge, discussing the environment. And I'd like to point to two elements. One is the future, the other is the climate. So you said the natural sciences can help us understanding the past and the present through the past, and understand by the past the present. I think a very interesting aspect is to think of the future too. So these days we are, of course, confronted with the climate consequences on societies. So I think very many questions that you ask through your historical cases are incredibly relevant. Like, you know, I took note, like what makes a society dependent on the climate or vulnerable to the climate? A pastoral society, a society that relies on trade, commerce, industry. So there are differences that have to be taken into account to think and see the dependencies of our societies on the climate, the environments, and to see, you know, to think of future scenarios and take decisions. So this is one aspect that I think is incredibly important. So let me point to the future-orientedness of historical research. The other aspect is climate itself. So does history help us understanding climate? I think this is the other half of the story. So these days, when we think of climate, we don't see climate changing or climate affecting societies as much as we see societies or humans, technologies, industry affecting the climate. So we are facing a climate that is we don't look just at the consequences of climate, we see the causes of climate, and these causes are anthropic. These are anthropic causes that have their history. On that point, I'd like to challenge and see how we can integrate the reflection. So as a sort of loop, we see how climate transforms and affects our societies, and the loop is how can we think through history the climate change. And on that, just as a reflection, I think it's quite difficult to look at the past to see climate as changed by humans, because it seems to be the case that is unique of the predicament we are in. Maybe on that note, we might have to look at ecosystems, so the smaller scale issue in which we can, as historians, also see how humans transform their environments directly. Of course, it's not a planetary scale, but I think it's where we can also have a say.
Thank you, Pietro. Thank you very much about this. Well, I mean, the steppe ecology actually offers you some food for thought about, you know, not just how climate, but also how human beings change the environment. I mean, this is how it's been a very, very long discussion about among ecologists about so-called disequilibrium. And that is the idea that these economies are never in a state of equilibrium. because they are inherently there's an inherent imbalance, which stems from the fact that the more animals you have, the more the environment deteriorates. And the more it deteriorates, of course, the fewer animals you can keep on the same patch of land. So there's always they always strive for a balance, but it's very, very difficult to achieve, almost impossible, because there's always this alternation between an excess of animals and a scarcity of animals that is connected with the productivity of the land. And in this case, humans have to have play a role in this, in the preservation of the environment, and how they channel resources towards the preservation of that environment is a very interesting point. One way is to diversify pastoral production, for instance. So you have the famous 5 types of animals: horses, cows, camels, sheep, and goats. So these are the 5 traditional animals. Now there is a kind of engineering going on, because each of these animals damages the land or uses the land in a different way. So there's what I would call a science behind this that we need to understand, and they make mistakes. Political decisions can lead to a number of problems in this. They want more horses, they want more cows, then the balance is broken. So even it's very important to point out that, as you did, that humans also change the environment. Yeah.
Of course, it's a very important point. Yeah, Cranshaw. Yes, you are.
Thank you. That was a fascinating lecture. I really enjoyed it. I mean, the first thing I have to say is I wish I had your research when I was working on my book. I would have cited you. Because there's so many parallels between what I wrote there and what you said, despite the fact that the cultures are separated by more than 3 millennia. So it was mostly on Indo-European migrations from the Western steppe and how that was actually triggered by a relationship between human and non-human animals. Which is where my question comes from. Because so in the book, I kind of stressed the role of wolves and horses in particular, and you talked about horses as well. And I know that there is this kind of, in the mythology of Mongolia, the wolf as well occupies a crucial role. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more on specifically the role of non-human animals in all of this, or in a case study, whichever you prefer. Thank you.
I wish I'd read your book. I'm sorry, but I will. And I don't. There was a book that came out not so long ago and became very, very famous in China, which was called Wolf Totem. I immediately think about this, and Francesca, and it's a modern reflection exactly about that kind of ecological balance in a pastoral environment between gazelles and wolves, and so basically between domesticated species and non-domesticated species, and how that balance can be altered by human action and beliefs as well. I mean, there is a whole knowledge system that goes into preserving the balance between the different species that may it doesn't get in directly into my research. Maybe it should. I don't know but looking back in time, and not as back as you go, but let's say 3,000 years ago, hunting was the main source. I mean, the kind of lore that comes and religious beliefs that come from a hunting spiritual world is the main source of religious beliefs, I would say, among pastoral nomads. It doesn't come from a pastoral, it's closely connected. All these totemic images, I mean, they're all connected with non-domesticated animals, with perhaps the exception of the horse to a certain degree. But otherwise, hunting and hunting has been part of these societies forever. Even though some species have been completely almost hunted to extinction. But what is the place of non-human animals? I would say, well, let's distinguish between domesticated and non-domesticated ones in the first place, and then the relationship between this hunting world and this pastoral world, which these people inhabited, and their art, for instance, is all about hunting and animal behavior and struggles and so on. And the whole shamanic world, let's say the world of shamanism, is also closely connected with that spiritual beliefs of animal spirits, let's say, that comes from hunting. So an object of study and reflection, but I don't have a better answer, I'm sorry.
Just graduated, so I am a medical doctor from my education. I would like to ask to you, you wrote with Buntigen that article in 2016. After not 10 years, but after 7-8 years, do you think that the things you wrote there about the societal changes, the fall of the Sasanian Empire, the problem of the Justinianic plague, the problem of the Arabs that went out from the peninsula, are still valid? Or do you think that after some years you would write something different on that topic?
Which article is that?
That one of cooling society in
the Lalia, yeah.
Yes.
No, even as I was participating in that article, I didn't quite believe the conclusions because it's the one article that that referred to that. We used the climate results from that article and this general idea of cooling between 536 and 682, which I believe that is true, that there is a general cooling during that period. Now, the connections between this cooling and social and political, especially events, is very dubious. Is extremely dubious. In fact, some historians, I mean, there are 25 authors in that article, and I take my responsibility for my part, that we didn't have the space to. This is another problem, that publishing in scientific journals is incredibly frustrating for historians. I'm sorry to say this. We cannot say what we want to say. So it was all reduced to a correlations between certain climatic data and historical things. So that I try to avoid as much as possible. But it was still important, I guess, for scientists to point out that certain things were going on during this time that might deserve more research in the future. So I took these correlations simply as suggestions for future research, and the future research may, will certainly prove something different, or certainly this connection, mechanical connection between climate effect and social whatever. Social political event is not sustainable, obviously. But we mentioned like 10 different cases from the Roman Empire to China. And so it was simply a heuristic, as they say, way of contextualizing a little bit this period historically. I wouldn't pay any attention to it, honestly.
What do you find in the sources? Because you read several languages, right? You go through, I guess, systematically a number of languages, and do you find climate in the sources? I mean, or in what way can one find climate in your historical sources, or reference to? How does one go about collecting that kind of data?
Thank you, Francesca. This is, as you can imagine, opening a Pandora's box for various reasons. First of all, historical records are needed by climatologists in various ways. For instance, how do you find out which volcano erupted without historical records? You have sulfate, records in the ice cores, but you don't know where they come from, right? So most identifications of volcanic eruptions come from historical records. So this is one example. I guess not all of them. I mean, one can guess also from the type of tephra, I guess, where the eruption happened. But they do look at historical records. Now, the problem is that historical records change from society to society. And in China, they have the climatologists use historical records as a reservoir, as a kind of proxy records, just like tree rings and ice cores and so on. Then there are historical records. And this is very problematic in some ways because they create historical climate reconstructions based on historical records that come from any number of records without a specific analysis of the source. So source criticism is non-existent in this. And of course, as we know, there may be many different reasons why we have a climate record. And in ancient China, as everybody knows, omens, these disasters could be political omens. And therefore, not unsurprisingly, I think around when there's a political crisis, also there is a greater rate of disasters recorded in the historical sources. So we cannot. So when you look at the sky, let's say, or at nature for political signs of some sort or another, that clearly creates a problem for what kind of climate. Is it political climate? Is it atmospheric climate that we are looking at? So there are these problems. But nevertheless, there are certain Chinese historical sources, in particular gazettes, local gazetteers, that can be reliable because they have systematic records of the blossoming of cherry trees or something like that, which can give phenological information. In other words, they can give us reliable sources. They don't go back 2,000 years. So the further back you go into history, the more complicated it is, I would say. But Chinese climatologists also look at oracle bones. Yes.
Good evening, and thanks for coming. Your title has the word empire in it, and as we think of empire, we're also thinking of its shadow, which is the people who refuse to participate in empire or who exist at its margins. And what this makes me wonder is because empires are often easily found in historical sources, while as people at the margins are not. Do you see that there is any possibility, as you're going forward with climate research, to include people who are at the margins of empire or who choose actively not to be in empire to be included in discussions of how climate affects political formations, economies, and livelihoods?
Thank you. I should say that even the word empire is problematic in this. Some people call them confederations, some people call them nations. I mean, this terminology is very fluid, let's say, and it's not stable in any ways. So I prefer to look at each of these, let's say, political formations in their historical existence. And so let's make an example. Let's take the Mongols as an example, where there are people who were disenfranchised or marginalized, or yes, many people, most of them probably, were in fact had no power whatsoever. There is quite a lot of research now on people who were forcibly moved from one place to another of the territorial empire, but then again, the Chinese part of the Mongol Empire functioned differently from the Muslim part of the Mongol Empire, the Ilkhanate, the Persian part of the Mongol Empire. And Russia works differently as well, and Central Asia. So why? Because they adjust to local conditions. You have to look at the local elites, for instance. The local elites are all very different. So they tend to rule through intermediaries. And social relations do not change as much, probably as much as we think. So the people who are disenfranchised before the empires was created probably continue to be disenfranchised later as well. There is a difference with China, for instance, where you have clear ethnic classifications introduced by the Mongols. So once you have an ethnic classification, then the people are ethnically at the bottom of that hierarchy. Then it doesn't matter what their class position or the money or their knowledge is. They are automatically at the bottom of the social structure. So so there are some changes that are introduced by new political formations in the way in which society works. But again, I don't see how this is connected necessarily with climate or environmental issues. It could be. There was a dissertation recently that I examined. It was a very interesting one on China, central China in the 17th century. And China had been conquered by foreign people, so it's new rulers, new social structures, the banners and so on. And these people in central China were controlled. I mean, the production, rice and so on, whatever agricultural production was still controlled by the old elites very much. And they did not bring, the Manchus, did not bring any new knowledge to this, to their empire in terms of climate awareness or consciousness or anything like that. So, I mean, the pre-modern world is hard to say what, how knowledge works outside of certain rather thin layers of society and classes. So I would say that most people are either enslaved or in a situation of servitude yeah.
Any more questions? Thank you so much.
Thank you.